There's a very specific moment that happens before a major change in someone's life. Curiously, that moment is almost never noticed while it is happening. There is no external noise. There is no obvious sign. There is no announcement that something is about to change. But internally, something begins to reorganize. The mind stops fighting. The body begins to relax. And a silent sense of certainty appears. Most people think reality changes first on the outside, but those who begin to observe with more awareness notice something else. Before any visible turning point, there is always a very subtle internal shift. And when that shift happens, the way reality responds begins to change as well. Now it's worth looking at the first sign of this silent reorganization that almost no one notices. Now it's worth observing the first sign of this silent reorganization that almost no one notices when reality is about to change. The mental silence that precedes the reorganization of reality. Before an important change happens, something very curious begins to happen inside the mind. The noise decreases. That constant need to analyze everything, predict every scenario, imagine 1,000 different possibilities, begins to disappear. It is as if the mind finally gets tired of fighting its own desire. Many people spend months, sometimes years, trying to manifest something while the mind is full of tension, thinking too much, trying to control too much, trying to understand every detail of the process. But shortly before a real turning point happens, that excess of analysis begins to lose strength, and in its place something different appears. A simpler kind of focus, quieter, more direct. You still want that thing, but you are no longer fighting reality all the time. You are no longer asking every minute whether it will happen. And this state is far more powerful than it seems, because when the mind enters this kind of silence, thought, intention, and expectation finally begin to point in the same direction. There is no longer that divided internal conversation. One part believing, another part doubting. There is only a calm sense of direction. And here, there is something important that almost no one notices. Many people think manifestation happens when you think a lot about what you want. But many times, it actually begins exactly when you stop mentally fighting the process. When the desire stops being an internal debate and becomes simply a choice. Now pay attention to this. If at some recent moment you noticed that your mind became quieter regarding something you really want, without anxiety, without that constant urgency, this may be a sign that something inside you has already begun to align. And in the next moment, something even more interesting happens. The feeling that used to be a surge begins to transform into something completely different. And it is exactly here that the second sign appears, which almost always shows up before a real change. The dominant feeling changes from searching to certainty. At the beginning of the process, the feeling is usually one of searching. The person thinks about what they want and feels something like, I hope it happens. I hope it works out. Will this really manifest? There is desire, but doubt is still mixed in. But at a certain moment, something begins to change. The feeling stops being a request. It begins to transform into a much calmer sensation, a kind of naturalness. It is not euphoria. It is not exaggerated enthusiasm. It is almost the opposite of that. It is as if somewhere inside you, that thing has already found space. You continue walking. You continue living your routine, but something inside you begins to treat that result as something possible, even expected, and this detail completely changes the vibration you emit. Because when the feeling stops being, I want this to happen, and becomes, this makes sense for me, the internal field becomes much more stable, and vibrational stability is what allows reality to begin responding more easily. Now let me ask you something quickly. While you listen to this, notice if there is something in your life today that has already started to create that sense of naturalness, something that once seemed distant, but now begins to feel possible. If there is, right here in the comments, just one word: aligned. This helps not only you recognize this state, but it also helps other people watching realize that they are not alone in this process. And if this kind of content is helping you see your own mind more clearly, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel now. because the more you understand how your internal state organizes reality, the easier it becomes to recognize these signs before changes happen. And soon after that moment, a third sign appears that many people ignore, but that the body itself begins to demonstrate. And it is exactly at this point that a third sign appears that many people ignore, but that is extremely revealing. The body enters coherence with the thought. Even before any change appears on the outside, the body begins to demonstrate that something internal has reorganized. Breathing becomes calmer. The tension in the shoulders decreases. The mind no longer keeps returning to the same thought all the time. It is as if the body finally stops reacting to the desire as something distant. Think about how we normally react when we want something very much. The body goes into alert mode. Breathing becomes short. The chest feels tight. The mind accelerates. Now observe when something begins to align. The body changes. You continue thinking about what you want, but that physical pressure is no longer there. There is presence. There is a feeling that you can continue living normally without that constant anxiety. And this detail is far more important than it seems, because the body is one of the first places where alignment appears. Before external reality reorganizes, the internal system needs to enter coherence. Calmer thought, more stable emotion, more present body. When these three things begin to move together, something curious happens. The person stops reacting to the desire as if it were far away and begins to treat it as something possible. And soon after that, another very interesting sign appears. The mind simply stops looking for proof all the time. And when that happens, the way you relate to reality itself changes completely. Now, a fourth sign appears that is very revealing, but that many people interpret the wrong way. The mind stops looking for external signs. At the beginning of manifestation, it is common for a person to keep looking for confirmations all the time. They look at everything, trying to find a sign, a repeated number, a coincidence, an unexpected message, anything that seems to prove that it will happen. This happens because there is still insecurity. The mind wants guarantees. It wants to be sure the process is working. But when alignment begins to consolidate, something naturally changes. The person simply stops looking for proof all the time, not because they gave up, but because they no longer feel the need to confirm it. The focus changes completely. Instead of monitoring reality, they begin protecting their own internal state. They realize that the most important thing is not finding signs on the outside, it is maintaining clarity on the inside. And this is a very interesting point, because when the mind stops testing the process all the time, the energy stops being divided. There is no longer that alternation between believing and doubting. There is only continuity. And it is exactly in this type of continuity that manifestation finds space to happen more easily. Soon after this moment, something even more curious usually appears. Almost always a very simple action emerges, but extremely aligned with what you want to experience. And it is exactly at this point that a fifth very interesting sign appears. A simple action appears, but extremely aligned. When the mind and the feeling enter coherence, something curious begins to happen. A big strategy does not appear. A complex plan does not appear. Most of the time, only a small action appears. Something simple. It could be sending a message you had been postponing, making a decision you had been avoiding, starting something small that once seemed insignificant. The difference is that this action does not come from anxiety. It comes from clarity. It is the kind of movement that you feel makes sense, even if you still do not know exactly where it will lead. And this happens because when the internal state organizes itself, the mind begins to see paths that previously went unnoticed. Many people believe manifestation happens only by thinking or visualizing. But in practice, reality usually responds when that internal state turns into small coherent movements. It is not acting out of desperation, it is acting because it feels natural. And many times, it is exactly this small action that begins to unlock something bigger. Soon after that, another sign appears that almost always accompanies this moment. The emotional field enters something that most people rarely experience for very long. stability. And when this stability appears, reality begins to find far less resistance to respond. Now we arrive at one of the most important signs of all, and curiously one of the rarest as well. The emotional field enters vibrational stability. Most people fluctuate emotionally a lot when they desire something. At one moment they are extremely excited, believing everything will happen. In the next moment, doubt appears, then anxiety, then expectation, then frustration. This type of oscillation creates an unstable field. And when the emotional field is unstable, reality takes longer to reorganize. But when alignment truly begins to happen, something different appears. There is no longer that exaggerated euphoria, but there is also no longer that constant doubt. What appears is a simpler sensation. Stability. You continue believing in what you want, but you no longer feel that urgency. The mind no longer returns to the same thought every 5 minutes. The body no longer reacts as if it were an emergency. There is a kind of steady calmness, as if internally you have already accepted that possibility as part of your path. And this state is extremely powerful, because when the feeling stabilizes, the vibration stabilizes as well. And when the vibration stabilizes, reality encounters much less resistance to respond. That is exactly why many manifestations begin to happen when the person is no longer obsessed with the result. Because at that moment, the emotional field has finally entered coherence. And when this coherence is maintained for some time, the final sign of this process appears. The state of receiving begins to become dominant. And it is at this point that many changes begin, in fact, to appear in the physical plane. And so we arrive at the final sign of this silent process. The state of receiving becomes dominant. There is a very specific moment when the mind simply stops trying to push reality. Before that, even when the person believes, there is still a small mental effort happening. They think about the desire. They imagine when it will happen. They wonder if it is already close. But when the state of receiving begins to appear, something changes very naturally. The mental effort decreases. The person continues to desire it, continues to remain open for it to happen, but no longer feels the need to force the process. It is as if internally a simple sense of readiness appears. You continue living your routine. You continue making decisions. You continue moving forward in your life, but there is no longer that silent urgency trying to accelerate everything. And this detail is extremely important, because when the mind stops pressing, the internal field finally creates space for reality to reorganize. Many times it is exactly at this moment that concrete signs begin to appear. An opportunity appears, a conversation opens a new possibility, a situation that seems stuck begins to resolve, not because something magical suddenly happened, but because the internal state that was previously in search is now in openness. And when the dominant state stops being effort and becomes receiving, life finds much more space to respond. Now notice something interesting. Many people think manifestation happens when you think a lot about something. But in practice, many of the most important changes begin exactly when you reach this point, when you are no longer trying to convince reality, you are simply ready to live what you decided to sustain within yourself.